So Baruch Hashem, this morning I was a sandik, and a sandik he give brachas, a sandik to a grandson. Baruch Hashem, this morning we had a bris of a grandson, and I very much hope Noiled ben Zochen esrap kol hamishpocha. So first I want to give a bracha to all my dear Talmidim and anybody listening to the Shiur. We should only share beside his tovus, and I want to ask all of you, please daven, throw in a kapitel tehillim for my mother who is not doing very well. She's in the hospital and she needs chazdei shumayim. So the Torah we learn today is refuah shleima lemoras Fradl bat Leah. Kodesh Baruch Hu should send her refuah shleima, and we very much hope and daven she should be well and still have arichas yamim v'shonim. And I ask you to please take note of the name and daven for her. This week is Parshas Lech Lecha, and we start the story of the Jews. First two Parshias in the Torah, Bereshis and Noach, deal with the giants of yore, Odom, Rishon, and Noach. But our story starts with Avraham Avinu, first and foremost amongst the Ovis HaKadoshim. And these Parshias are what Chazal describe, Perikei Mesechet Avos, Asora Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu va'omad bekulam. And one of them is Mitzvah Milah. And today we will be discussing Mitzvah Milah in circumstances which might be a sakona for the child. So in Yevomis Samech Daled, in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Beis, in various different sources in Shas, it is clear that you do not perform Mitzvah Milah if it might jeopardize the life of the child. Tinoik shemeso echov machmes mila machloikes Rebbe v'Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Is 2 times enough to be kovea chazaka, or 3 times? But everybody agrees a child whose brothers died after Mila, we do not do circumcision to that child, because Pekuach Nefesh overrides Mitzvah Mila. And in Shabbos and in Chulin, the Gemara says, if a child seems to be very green, his skin, or red, then we wait, because we do not ever jeopardize the life of a child to perform Mitzvah Milah. When the Rambam brings this halacha, and Sof Perek Aleph of Hilchos Mina, and I'm reading the Rambam, a gewaldige chiddush. Ein malim elo vlad she'em bo shum choli, shesakones nefoshes doiches hakol, ואפשר למול אחר זמן, ואפשר להחזר, נפש אחס מיסוד לעולם. So the Rambam says, why do we not do Milah when the child is בסכנה? ואפשר למול לאחר זמן. And many of the Gedolei Achronim understood that the Rambam as if stipulates, it is only because אפשר לומר לאחר זמן. We could postpone the Milah, and therefore why put the child's life in jeopardy? Mashma Medivre Rambam, if we would not have the opportunity to do Milah without jeopardizing the child's life, we would do Milah immediately. How does that fit in with the basic halacha, Pikuach Nefesh Doicha, Kol HaMitzvah Shebetoyah? So before I share with you my opinion, which I think is emes and pashtus, I want to briefly mention some of the drochim of Gedolei Achronim. And this brings us to the fundamental sugi in Yom Daf Pei Hey. How do we know that Pekuach Nefesh is Doicha Kol HaMitzvah Shebetoyah? And the Gemara brings kamo v'kamo, various different approaches from Gedolei Tanoim. And the climax, the punchline is Shmuel, first generation of Ameroi Bavel, where Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says, V'chai behem, elet v'ro mashiach soisem odom, v'chai behem v'lo shiyomes behem. And the Gemara says, Kilius lepercha, lebar b'dishmol. All the other approaches, all the other explanations have a problem besides Shmuel. The Chasam Soife Yoredei Reish Memhei wants to explain the Rambam according to Reb Shimon ben Menasya. But the problem is, as the Chasam Soifer himself notes, Ein halachic Reb Shimon ben Menasya ele kishmoel. So why would the Rambam give us a halacha which is not la halacha? What does Reb Shimon ben Menasya say? How do we know Pekuach Nefesh is Doicha Kol HaMitzvah Shebetoyah v'Shomru b'nei Yisrael eis HaShabbos la'asois es HaShabbos? Chalel olav Shabbos achas, kedei sheyishma Shabbos harba. That is a very well-known svara of Reb Shimon ben Menashe, and the source is in Yuma Pehei, and also in Masechet Shabbos. The understanding of the Chassam Sofer is, we cannot be Mechana Shabbos only to give the child or the person opportunity to be Mekayim this very same mitzvah on a greater scale. And that is Chalel Olav Shabbos Achas Kedei Sheyishma Shabbos harba. It is also the understanding of Agoras HaRashash on this spot. It is only he should be able to be Mekayim Shabbos harba that we are Mechalal and violate Shabbos Achas. So the Chassam Sofer says in the same way, Batel Olav Milah Achas Kedei Sheyiskalakayim Milois harbe. If you will be Mekayim Mitzvah Milah right now, the child might die in a few minutes, in a few hours, in a few days, but he won't have very much time to be Mekayim Mitzvah Milah. If you wait till he is well, and you do Milah then, he could be Mekayim Mitzvah Milah for 100 years. And that is what the Rambam says, Ef Shalom Aliyah Achar Zman. If not Ef Shalom Aliyah Achar Zman, we would not be Mevatel Mitzvah Milah for Pikuach Nefesh, because it is only Shabbos Achas, Kedei Sheyishma Shabbos harba. So this pshat has two huge problems. First of all, why would the Rambam write anything based on Reb Shimon ben Menashe when the Gemara says Kuli Yisla Percha, and the halacha is V'chai ben v'lo sheyomes ben? Even according to the Shimon ben Menashe, I think it's a gewaldige doichik to say pshat that it is only Shabbos for Shabbos, Milah for Milah. No, it doesn't make sense. The Gemara says, Yom Pehei Yom Aleph. Mechala and Shabbos afilu b'shvil chayesho. Chayesho means hours, days, minutes. So there is no Kedei Sheyishma Shabbos harba, and afar piken, we're Mechala and Shabbos. Kama rochik loimer, that this fundamental assumption, we're Mechala Shabbos for Chayesho, is not according to Reb Shimon ben Menashe, and he disagrees. No, very unlikely. I think everybody agrees, no matter what the source is, that we're Mechala Shabbos for Chayesho. So how would we deal with mitzvahs matzah, cholesh sheyesh b'sakon? Would we say, only if doctors assume he has at least 2 years to live? Batel olav matzah achas kedei sheyesh bo matzahs harba, mi'et rabim shnayim. So if a doctor says he's sickly, he's terminally ill, and he also will be putting his life in jeopardy if he eats matzah, he doesn't have 2 years to live. He's terminally ill. He has weeks, months, a year. So would we say he needs to eat matzah even though he might die? Because we can't say Chalal of matzah achas kedei sheyishma matzah harba, at least 2 years. Lani is daiti? No. There's some sofer and the Rashash. Lani is daiti. Ketalma de dan lefnei Reb Oisa bekarka. Even Reb Shimon ben Menashe doesn't mean Shabbos harba. Mitzvos harba. He doesn't mean Shabbos harba. And that is also the problem with the second shot. Shuvas Beis Yitzchok. Megadoyle Galitzia Reb Yitzchok Shmalkas Yoredei Esem Tzadik. His interpretation is based on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. What does Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say? How do we know Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaMitzvahs? Kal v'choim Milah. Uma Milah she'en ele be'ever achas. Is Doiche Shabbos, Pikuach Nefesh Kol Gufa. Is a Kal v'choim Doiche Shabbos. Pshutoi shel inyan, pashtus, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah means Milah is Tikun Evar. For the shleimus of one Eva, one Mechala Shabbos, Kal v'chomer, to salvage a person's life, to save his whole body and his whole life. But Rashi says, Tikkun Eva means if one doesn't do Milah, it's Chayav Koros. So in a way, it's like Pikuach Nefesh. Rabbeinu Chananel, on the spot, Rabbeinu Chananel has a similar approach. And he quotes the Posuk in Parshas Shemais, Vayhi b'derech b'moloin, when Moshe Rabbeinu didn't perform Mitzvah Milah with his son, and the angel wanted to kill the boy, and v'tikrach tzapoyres atzor v'tichras es oros bana v'yorof mimena. So she saved his life by doing Mitzvah Milah. So according to Rashi Rabbeinu Chananel, the reason that Milah is Derech Shabbos in a way is because it is similar to Pikuach Nefesh. Once again, Ein halocha ke Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. and even in accordance to Halacha ben Azariah. It is only b'derech remez, b'derech drash. If we say Milah is not Doiches Shabbos, then the child's life is in no sakana. The sakana is only because he violates a mitzvah. But if that is the halacha, Milah ain't a Doiches Shabbos, then we got to wait for Sunday. Nothing will happen. This is his mitzvah. So the pshat of the Besitzuk is also, Eino Misyashav Aleiv. Avne Nezi Yoredei Shin Chovav. His pshat is so complicated, I won't even try to share it with you. You could look it up. Shin Chovav Be'ikar Ois Yud Beis Chuvas Avne Nezi Yoredei. Number 4 is the son of the Avne Nezi, Shemesh Mor. Ala Torah Pasha Semer brings in his father's name. The Gemara in Gittin Nun Zayin, Amid Beis, Ki Olecho Horagnu Kol Hayoim Ze Mitzvahs Milah. So the Shemesh Small says, Milah is a sakona. It is always a sakona. Ki Olecho Horagnu Kol Hayoim. V'yafar piken bo'och echai v'rechmona. The Torah says, you got to do Milah even though it's a sakona. So we perform Milah regardless of the sakona. So even if there's additional sakana, we still need to do mitzvahs milah. So the only reason not to jeopardize the child's life is efshar lo chaliyachar zman. If we could be mekayim the mitzvah without putting his life in danger, that is definitely preferable. But if we could not be mekayim mitzvah liyachar zman without putting the child's life in jeopardy, we would do milah miyad regardless of the sakana, because that is the mitzvahs milah. So I want to make 2 comments. I think Pashtus Kavonas Gemara is not that Milah is a sakana, but rather Chazal stressed the Mesiras Nefesh of Klal Yisrael in every generation. So many times in our tortured history, there were Gzeiros always against mitzvahs Milah. The Romans and the Greeks and the Persians and the Bolsheviks and the Nazis. And Jews were always moise nefesh on mitzvahs milah. That is what Chazal mean. Ki olecho horagnu kol hayoim. But I do remember Rashi. Rashi says no. Rashi says sometimes a child might die as a result of milah. And afal piken ki olecho horagnu kol hayoim. But I still would argue, no. That is extremely uncommon. It is not defined halachically as a sakana. And even if it would be defined as a sakona, like the Chassam Sofer writes in Siman Reish Mem Hey, and I'll get to the Chassam Sofer in a few minutes, we will still say the Torah is mechayev mitzvahs milah regardless of the minimal sakona it might incur. But when there is an additional reason for sakona, the child is ill, meisa echov machmas milah, that's different. In that case, we would say pikuach nefesh overrides mitzvahs milah. So all these Achronim understood the Rambam, that the Rambam actually means to say the only reason that we are not mal a child who is ill is because Ef Shalom Aleyach Hazman. If not for Ef Shalom Aleyach Hazman, we would do Milah and disregard the sakana, ignore the sakana. So I want to say 2 Pirushim in accordance to their understanding, but then I will explain that my understanding is fundamentally different. What I would say, Aliba de Achroinim Hanal. I come back to the same tshuva in the Chassam Sofer. He has another comment in Reish Mem Hey. The Chassam Sofer says, on the same Gemara in Gittin, Ki olech waragnu kol hayoim zeh mitzvahs milah. Milah, in biology and medicine, is a sakona for the child. And after Piken, we have a Mitzvah of Milah, and a Kodesh Baruch Hu shomer umatzil yaldei Yisrael. And it's a shmira de le'ela. It is above and beyond the realm of nature and medicine. This gula of mitzvah milah and this great mitzvah safeguards the child. Mekol machalom, mekol nezek, mekol tekola. And that is the understanding of the Chassam Sofer, ki olech waragnu kol hayoim. So maybe the Rambam maintains, even if there is an additional sakona, it's the same shemira, and we could rely on a Kodesh Baruch Hu to safeguard the child, that Milah should not cause him chas v'sholem to die. So that is why the Rambam said, it is only because Ef Shalom Aliyach Hazman, without any sakana, that we wait. The other thing I would say, recently I spoke about this. The Avnei Nezer has a gewaldige kasha, and a halacha that we all are familiar with. The Gemara in Yevomis, and it's in the beginning of Avnei Nezer. Person married a wife. She'd bared no children for 10 years. He needs to divorce her and marry another wife. It is not minhag ha'olam, but that's not our topic today. This is not the halacha we're to discuss. I just bring this halacha because of the Avnei Nezer. So Avnei Nezer has a gewaldige kasha. So the Avnei Nezer, many times they say with a touch of humor, had a split personality in the most positive way, not chas v'sholem in a negative way. On one hand, he was a Hasidic Rebbe, the head of a Hasidic dynasty, the Sochatcher Rebbe. On the other hand, he was one of the greatest Gedolim of his generation. Not only an unbelievable Gadol, he totally altered and changed course. The Derech HaLimit in Poland, he totally changed. So the kasha is a kasha of the Avnei Nezer, the teretz is a teretz of the Sochatcher Rebbe. So what am I talking about? Person married a wife. After 10 years, he needs to be Mekayim Prior Vio, so he needs to divorce his wife and marry another. Simen Tov Reish Nun Vav Shulchan Aruch Archaim, the Shulchan Aruch says, Ein Odom Chayav Lebazbez Hoin L'Havel HaMitzvahs. You are not required to spend a lot of money to perform a mitzvah. And Minchas Osher Kroli HaMitzvahs is a brilliant discussion. So how much money do we need to spend? That's not our topic today. But the Avnei Nezer asked such a poshet kasha, I wonder why nobody asked it before him. Is your wife worth less than $1,000 or $2,000 or $10,000? Really? Person doesn't need to spend a lot of money on a mitzvah. Eishes ne'urav yeshefes cheikoi asher ohav. Why does he need to divorce his wife to perform a mitzvah to say? Is she less worthy than a few $1,000 than Hoin Rav? The Avnei Nezer answers, the halacha in Shulchan Aruch Archaim Tov Reish Nun Vav deals with Lulav and Esrog. You had the mitzvah a year ago. B'ezrat Hashem, we hope to perform the mitzvah again a year later. But not to be Mekayim a mitzvah all your life is different. Because the Mekabolim say that if you miss any mitzvah in one Gilgal, you have to come back to the world again to be mashlim. Because ultimately a person needs to be Mekayim all Taryag mitzvahs. So in order not to come to this world once again, you need to spend everything, even give a get to your wife. So if he won't marry another woman, obviously he will never be Mekayim the mitzvah all his life, and that's different. I Samach Roinim say the same Yisod without speaking about Gilgulim. And it's a Svara Pshuta. There's a difference between Bittul Mitzvahs to say once in your lifetime and Bittul Mitzvahs to say all your lifetime. So maybe in order not to be Mevatla Mitzvahs Milah all your life, we would put our lives in danger. So it is only because Ef Shalom Aliyach Hazman. So I dealt with 6 different interpretations. But now let me tell you what I really feel about this Rambam. Loi olo al datoi shel Rambam. To say the reason we do not do Milah when a child's life is in Sakona is because Ef Shalom Aliyach Hazman. No. It is because Skones Nefoshes Doiches Hakal. I want to read the Rambam again. Ein Malen Elo Vlad She'en Bo Shum Choili. Shesakonas nefoshes doiches hakal. Period. Then the Rambam says, ve'efshar locha la'achar zman, ve'efshar la'ach ze nefesh achas mi'yisrael yolam. Let us note, the Rambam doesn't write mishum she'efshar locha li'achas zman. He doesn't write mepnei she'efshar locha. It is not a reasoning. It's not the rationale. It's just a statement. Sekonas nefoshes doiches hakal. Ve'efshar lamul la'achar zman. Ve'efshar. And I think it's so pushed because what are the sakonas? What are the sakonas? Tinukshu yoroik, tinukshu odoim. The Rambam brings these halachas in the very same halacha. And the Gemara says, we wait. Yipol dam, yipol beidam, Yevlo Boidam. Even Tinuk Shemeso Echov Machmas Milah, the Rambam writes, Mamtinen lo ad sheyigdal v'yeschazek koichoi. So the Rambam just explains, why put a child's life in jeopardy? First of all, Skonos Navosh Doichas Hakal. Secondly, Shalom Uriachar Zman. The Rambam was a doctor, and he knows of no condition in which we could say we never could do Mitzvah of Milah. So the Rambam merely says, Ve'efshar lochal lachazman, ein kol mokoim ledayak memenoi, that if not efshar lochal lachazman, we would do Milah now and put the child's life in jeopardy. However, the B'siyos of Ki'ilu, just to make me frustrated, the B'siyos of is Mata Kloshan Rambam, and he changes one letter, Al Api Val Chamosi, Reish Samach Gemasif Aleph. The B'siyos of in Shulchan Aruch is Mata Kloshan Rambam, but instead of writing Ve'ef Shalom Aleyach Hazman, the Shulchan Aruch says She'ef Shalom Aleyach Hazman, and that has somewhat a different connotation, a different mashmois. It does indicate mepnei she'ef shalom al hazman. But the Gaon on the spot says yeseru mizi. It is not only mishum she'ef shalom al sekonas nefoshes doichas hakal. And once again, I want to make this point because to me, it's such a poshut, a convincing argument. Tinok shemesu echov machmas milah. Some Rishonim say we never circumcise the child. But the Rambam clearly says, Anshi yagdel v'yeschazek koichoi. So the Rambam, especially being one of the greatest physicians of his time, just says, why put a child's life in danger? If you wait, you could do Milah without any sakana. But that is just an addition. And that's why the Rambam writes, Ve'ef shalom aliyach hazman. But the basic, the fundamental reasoning of this halacha is, Sakonas nefoshes doriches hakol. Darkoi shel Rambam, and whoever learns a lot of Rambam is familiar. Many times the Rambam is moisef tam v'tavlen, even in a gezeres hakosov. What the Rambam primarily means to say, nothing is final in our lives besides death. And that is why pikuach nefesh is doicha hakal. So let me once again just briefly explain. In my opinion, the Rambam doesn't at all mean to say that the reason Sekoras Nefoshes is Doicha Milah is because and only because Efshaloch Aliyach Hazman. No, it is because Sekoras Nefoshes is Doicha Zakal. So the Rambam just means to say Efshaloch Aliyach Hazman, especially Rambam Lishitosoi. That is the fact. That is the Metzias. That is the medical, biological reality. Efshaloch Aliyach Hazman, and that is why it's a pshitas. Why put this child's life in jeopardy? Oid rega adabero, and this is number 8, and it's also emes ledati, emes la'amitoi. I want to retract and say, okay, I will accept the fundamental understanding of the Achronim. Why do we wait? Because we could wait. Ef shalom aliyach hazman. However, the Rambam writes this halacha in a certain context. Ein malen elovlad she'em bo shum choli. Why is that? Recently, I am very troubled by an interesting phenomena. We're living in a frum world, and sometimes the baby has a medical issue, and the family asks the doctor, could we do Milah or not? And that is a terrible mistake. The Rambam writes, Ein malen elo yeled she'em bo shum choli. Doctors have nothing to say. Yes, we ask a doctor, is the child ill? Does he have a medical condition? If he does, Ein malen elo vlad she'em bo shum choli. That is a halacha. And in this mitzvah, more than in any other, Chazal go to the extreme in sekonas nefashos and pikuach nefesh. Why is that? By Yom Kippur, do we say, Kol mi sheyesh lo shum choli eats on Yom Kippur? Of course not. We ask doctors. That is in Siman Tov Reish Yud Ches. Hilchos Shabbos. Do we say, anybody that has a medical condition is Mechala Shabbos? Of course not. We ask doctors. Hilchos Shabbos Shin Chof Ches. So why, when it comes to Milah, the Rambam says, Ein malan elo vlad shembo shum choli? Why don't we ask doctors? No, we don't ask doctors. By Milah, more than by Shabbos and more than by Yom Kippur, Chazal go to the extreme. If a child has any medical problem, any illness, any medical condition, we don't do Milah. Masam b'chol yom. By me, the doctors say, we don't see any reason you can't do a bris, and I say, the child is ill, we don't do the bris. So why are we machmebor by Milah, ben by Shabbos, by Yom Kippur? Ef shalom or liachar zman. So you're not even mevatel a mitzvah in its entirety. You are mevatel Milah bizmana, but it's not bitul mitzvahs Milah. And that is why Tinok sheyesh lo shum choli, even if the doctors would say no sakona at all, we wait. And that is where the Rambam says Ef Shalom Aliyach Hazman. So I addressed and suggested two different interpretations of the Rambam, and I think both are emes v'nochon v'yatzif. If a person does do Milah for a child, even though he's not allowed to do so because he's jeopardizing the child's life, was he Belkayim mitzvahs Milah? This is a broad and general question. When a person performs any mitzvah, and by performing the mitzvah, he puts his life in danger, does he have a mitzvah? Only Yom Tov Simmer Memalef, Chuvas Maram Shiki, or a Day Reish Memalef, or a Chaim Reish Memalef. Both say, if a person eats matzah, and he puts his life in danger by eating matzah, the brocha that he said is a brocha levatola, because he doesn't have a mitzvah. This might be because of mitzvah bo ba'aveira. However, there's an amazing Rashi. A child was born bekenishte de moin. Rabbi Yochanan paskend afal pisha meso echov machmes Milah. We should do the bris, and they did the bris. And Abaye said, "Keshores isura v'sakanta." You violated two halachas, two mitzvahs. First of all, you put a child's life in jeopardy, and that's an aveira. Lo yisamat adam riyacho v'nishmartu moed lenafshasechem. Chilul Shabbos as well. Because if you're endangering a child's life by Milah, it's like Milah Shaloi Bismana v'yenoi doiche Shabbos. This is an amazing svara of Rashi. He doesn't say it's not a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah. Because after all, the child is 8 days old. But it's like Milah Shaloi Bismana she'ena doiche Shabbos. Milah Shaloi Bismana is a mitzvah. And a doiche Shabbos. The same Milah when a child's wife might be in danger. So on one hand, it's medurek for Rashi, it is a mitzvah. Why don't we say mitzvah bo ba'aveira? Oh, many reasons. But we're not dealing today with the sig of mitzvah bo ba'aveira. I find this Rashi to be an amazing chiddush. Like Milah Shaloi B'zmano. What's the kesher? What is this comparison? If the child's life is a kon, it's an aveira, it's not a mitzvah. Milah Shaloi B'zmano, tzigzeh sakos aveina doiche Shabbos. Obviously, on one hand, Rashi feels that it is a mitzvah. But only Milah which is a chiyuv in this given day is doiche Shabbos. And that is why Milah Shaloi B'zmano in doiche Shabbos. Doesn't necessarily need to be in Shabbos. And that is why when there's a sakon, it's not doiche Shabbos. Because not only don't you have a chiyuv to be mal on this day, you are prohibited from being mal on this day. And that is why it can't be doiche Shabbos. And this brings me to a fascinating tshuva in Shalos Tshuvas Minchas Osher Chelek Gimel Siman Ayin Ches. What is the din of a non-Jew shemeso echov machmes Milah? And today we understand what's the problem of meso echov machmes Milah, what doctors didn't know thousands of years ago. Hemophilia. And that is a sickness, an illness in which one's blood doesn't clot. And even a minor wound could cause the demise of a person. He could bleed to death. And that is Mitzvah of Milah. A non-Jew wants to be Megayer, but the doctors say circumcision will put his life in danger. Reb Zalman Sorotzkin in a Sefer Oznaim LeTorah tells a story. I came to visit Reb Chaim Moishe and he was very annoyed. And he told me that a Mechaber asked him for a skum on a Sefer, and he writes that a guy whose life might be in danger by Milah could be Misgaya without Milah, Vedinoi Kiisho, just like a woman becomes a Gioris by Tefillah alone, the same a man, but he can't do Milah because he's putting his life in danger, then he becomes a Ger with Tefillah. And Reb Chaim Oizer said, I was moicha, it's a terrible mistake. He's a oral, and without Milah he can't do Geras. So what could he do? He can't do anything. His only option is to be a good guy. Machasida umes oilam. And they have Sechar Olam Haba. So Reb Zalman Sorotzkin doesn't share with us who was that Mechaber. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe Reb Chaim Oizer didn't tell him. But Rav Waldenberg, Tzitz Eliezer, Tezvav, Sif Aleph, does share the story. Two Sforim deal with this question, Chazoin Lamoyed and Ois Beris. Ois Beris is number one. He was one of the great Hungarian Rabbonim. And he writes in his Sefer, and the same in the other Sefer that I quoted, that a non-Jew who was a hemophilic patient and his life might be endangered by Milah could be Megaya with Tefillah alone. And in his Akdome he writes that I visited Reb Chaim Oizer, asked him for a skum, and he was angry about my psak, and he said, take it out. And the Mechaber writes, I apologize, I didn't take it out because I couldn't. Because when I came to the printer, he showed me that the Sefer is already printed. And therefore, Moiser Moidoa Ani, and he writes in the beginning of his Sefer, I retract my psak, but Reb Chaim Oizer disagreed with me. And therefore, please disregard what I wrote in my Sefer. So the Mechaber was very ehrlich and very honest, and he did exactly what Reb Chaim Oizer asked him to do. Ketalmed hadan lefnei Rabboisa bekarka. To me, it's not a milsa de pshita. It might depend on a machloikes Rashi Ramban and Yevomis Dafayin. Tinoik shemeso echov machmas Milah. Does he have a din of a orel? Is he entitled to eat truma and korban pesach? These are prohibited to a orel. Rashi says he is a orel, and it's also betruma, also bepesach. The Ramban says no. If he cannot do Milah because he might die, then he doesn't have a din of orel at all. And mutar lechol betruma vebepesach. According to the Ramban, I would see powerful argument. He's not an orel, and if he's not an orel, he becomes a ger with tefillah. Just like nichras hagid. If a person had an accident and he doesn't have the aver of Milah by accident, he becomes a ger with tefillah. According to the Ramban, the same would apply, Meisa Echov Machmas Milah. But Rashi, according to Rashi, Reb Chaim Oizer is right. He's an oral, and his vanoli can't become a Jew without Milah. Adayin yesh la'ayin. What I share with you now, I wrote decades ago. I don't remember whether it was a bocher or a younger man. Yesh la'ayin begeder milas gerus. Most of the Shonim maintain that a bezin is only ma'akav by tefillah, and tefillah comes after Milah. Yesh la'ayin b'milas gerus. Milah and tefillah. Are they both the same? And both are essentially masei gerus. Ein ha'odam nechnas lebris elo al yedei Milah v'tefillah. Or maybe no, totally different approach and interpretation. Gerus is tefillah. But just like every Jew needs to be mohul, every guy that wants to be a Jew needs to be mohul. What opens the gates is tefillah. But before we open the gate for you, you need to show that you did Milah. A person that's an orel, we don't let him in. So the Milah is just an introduction to Tefillah. What is Etzem Ageres is Tefillah. Milah is like a condition, it's like a stipulation. As long as you're an oral, you can't get in. We don't let you in. Just like every Jew needs to be circumcised. Every guy that wants to become a Jew first needs to do circumcision. And only when he's not an oral, he could ask, please let me in. And that is Tevilah. If Milah and Tefillah both have the same weight and both significance, then Reb Chaim Oizer is right. You cannot do Milah because it's a sakana. But as long as you're an oral, you can't get in. Because without Milah, you can't become a ger. That is what makes you a ger. But if Milah is just a condition, then there's room to argue. If I would be a Jew, I wouldn't need to do Milah. So why do you expect a guy to do more than you expect of a Jew? If a Yid is put on a Milah when it put his life in danger, we should use the same standard to a guy. Why would we require a guy to do what we would not expect of a Yid? But that is only if Milah is not essentially a part of the Geras, but a precondition to Geras. I was surprised to find in Sefer Minchas Soiles. Who was the Minchas Soiles? Reb Tevel Dukla. That is what he was known in Galicia, one of the greatest Gedolim. He was relatively young, and that is why he did not achieve a level of fame and renown as he would deserve. He was a young gadol murdered in the Holocaust by the Nazis. Hashem yinkom damoi, yamach shemam v'zicham. My Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, the Divrei Yatzev, saw Reb Tevel Adikla as his Rebbe Muvhak. He learned in his yeshiva. And he spoke about him in unbelievable admiration. In his eyes, he was one of the greatest Gedolim. And he has a sefer Minchas Soiles, similar to the Minchas Chanukah and Mitzvahs, and a Mitzvah base he writes, Kvar herachti b'tshuva, that a goy shemesa echov machmas Milah could become again with Tefillah alone. Shelo kedivrei Achiezer. We don't have that tshuva. So I don't know what this psak was based on, but I already shared with you what I think this psak would be based on. So I mentioned that Tshuva wrote about a hemophilic that wanted to become a ger. So even though in my opinion he could become a ger with Tefillah, like the Minchas Soiles, Reb Tevel Dukla, his name was Reb David Tzvi Zeman, and Tevel was a nickname, a kinui. However, halocha lamaisa, I wouldn't dare, but ladati le Reb Chaim Oizer. I suggested we do Milah with a laser beam, and that is what they actually did. So there's no hemorrhaging, there's no major bleeding. So his life in no way was in danger. But there is a drop of blood coming out, and that is enough to be Mekayim v'gam at b'dam bris. That is enough to be seen as dam bris, and that is how we did the Milah, and Baruch Hashem, he was Zoicha ledovek b'yasol v'leikones lebris as a ger tzedek. So this is a very interesting discussion. And we could go on for hours, but I think I gave you some very fundamental yesodis and svoris. As I said at the beginning of today's shiur, the Mishnah says in Perikei Avos, Asora nesyonis nesnas Avrom Avinu v'yobed b'kolam, and many times I explained why. Avrom Avinu was the giant. You just need to learn the Rambam, beginning of Avodah Zorah, to learn about the greatness of Avrom Avinu. And he was the first and only one that found the Kodesh Baruch Hu without being taught by anyone. He had no Messiah. His father Terach was an idol worshipper, an Oived Avodah Zorah. So we would expect HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bless Avrom Avinu with a utopian life of bliss, of blessing, of happiness. It was not to be. One assoying after the other, one hardship, one tragedy after the other. And why is that? Not for Avrom, for us. Avrom Avinu is first and foremost of Avosseinu Agdoshim. The Tenes Yonis span and touch upon the entire human experience. everything one could imagine in the course of Jewish life, all the difficulties, all the struggles, were part of the Asura Nisyonis. Starting off with Lech Lecha, the first wandering Jew. Kodesh Baruch Hu tells him, leave everything behind, everything you love, everything you're familiar with. Leave your family, leave your social circle, leave your homeland and go. And Avraham asks, where am I going? And the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, you do not need to know. Ela oretz asher areko, I will show you the way. He packs up and leaves. That was the first Nisayan. Ur Kasdim, putting his life in jeopardy in the Kivshan Aweish. Physical pain, Mitzvah of Milah, when he was 100 years old. Poverty and hunger. And the ultimate Nisayan, Akedes Yitzchak. Slaughter your own son is bincho esechitcho asher ahavto. And all these Yisonis, each one of them in a different nature, all to give a koyach for Klal Yisrael throughout the ages, a koyach of Mesiras Nefesh. And that is why the Balaturim writes, V'yohavto es Hashem Elokecha, b'chol avavcho, b'chol nafshecho, b'chol moedecho. And Chazal's interpretation is, b'chol nafshecho, afilo noitel es nafshecho. You need to give away your life for a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Balaturim writes, V'yohavto is the same letters as ha'avois. It is only in the merit of the Avos that we have the koyach to do so. When Hananiah, Mishol, V'Azariah, Mosro, Navshom, L'Kedushas Hashem, B'Kiv Shenoish, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells, Malachei HaShores, L'chu v'nafshku sifsoiteim, Shel Avoiseim Shalele, Shemosro, Navshom, Al-Kedushas Hashem. They are great tzaddikim. But ultimately it comes from Avoiseim Shel Eila, Shemosru Nafsham Al Kedushas Hashem. Many times I explained the story Chazal said in Gittin Daf Nun Zayin, a Jewish mother. Unbearable pain and tragedy. 7 of her children were murdered before her eyes, just because they refused le'ishtach avois l'tzelem, and they were killed brutally, one after the other. Her youngest child was a child. She hugs him, she kisses him, and she says, Lech va'omarto l'Avraham Avinu, ato ukadatu mizbeach echad, v'ani akadati shiva mizbechois. What did she mean to say? Did she mean to say, I'm far greater than you are? That's inappropriate, totally inappropriate. I know the nitbas al tzara, but if that is what she was trying to say, why would Chazal tell us? Whatever Chazal tells us comes to teach something. It must be something positive. My understanding is this. She tells her youngest child, you're going to go up to heaven, to Gan Eden. Look for Avraham Avinu. They'll let you in. Those people that gave away their lives for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mechitzosem lefonim mechitzosem shel malachei hashores. Look for Avraham. And in my name say, thank you, Avraham. Ato okadetu mizbeach echad. Bekoichecho agodel ani zachiti lakriv shiva mizbechois. Thank you, Avraham. Your one sacrifice gave me and thousands of other Jews throughout the Golas the koyach of Mesiras Nefesh. That is my understanding, the Gemara in Gittin. When the Mishnah says, Sora Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu v'yomid b'kulam, Rashi, Perikei Masechet Avos says, V'lo hirer acharei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I remember many years ago, decades ago, I once spent time, private time, with my great Rebbe, the Divrei Yatz of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Wasn't in public, and he was speaking about his suffering and his travails in the Holocaust. He lost a wife and 11 children, and he was left alone, totally alone from his whole family. His oldest son, Lipa, was the apple of his eye. He was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and the Kloisenberger Rebbe had such high hopes. He survived the Holocaust, and he died from typhus after the liberation. And the Rebbe told me, of kan ein rega b'chnishmachar gewen achem yidoysev shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not for one moment that I doubt the HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways. And I remember hearing those words. I shuddered, and I shudder every time I remember, and every time I quote those words. So Rashi says, "Asor Nasyonis Nisnas Avrom Avinu v'yomed b'kulam v'lo hireh rachle midoysev shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." That is the Madrega of Avram Avinu, and that is the Madrega of the Divrei Yatzev of the Kloisem Bogerevi. Alavai, we should get there and have some of the spirit of Mesiras Nefesh, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should never put us to test like He tested our forefathers and our fathers. We should have the Mesiras Nefesh of Kiyum Mitzvahs, of Simchas HaTorah, of Omer HaTorah, not the Mesiras Nefesh of tragedy and of loss. So Avraham Avinu paved the way for all generations to come, the koyach of Mesiras Nefesh. I once again beg everyone, please daven for my mother, Moras Fradl Bas Leah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send her a refuah shalema. Have a beautiful day, and we should be zochel levasa b'seres tovos.